Hey guys, how you all doing there tonight? Today, we're on the August the 11th. I'm pre-recording this as the soundtrack for my radio shows that I do every Sunday on Fresh FM. We do 1 p.m. Sunday afternoons every second Sunday, or then we replay on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. I'm wearing my appropriately, as usual, my appropriate late breakfast show, aka coronavirus lockdown purple bathrobe. You can get these available at all bad warehouse stores or by joining the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy's Special Explorers Club. And I jest. Okay, so today what I'm going to just do is we're going to do a little bit of a show which is a little bit different from what I normally do, which is investigation based. I mentioned the date at the beginning because we have got the presidential alert come through on our phone. It's of course a system that's actually hooked up to the American, what used to be called the Federal Emergency Management Agency, but is now the National Emergency Management Agency, which is exactly the same as our new National Emergency Management Agency, which used to be the Civil Defence. And of course, the NEA have turned around and sent us this presidential alert, which I think says a lot in itself about the way of AI and software, but let's not go there. And I just found myself thinking about, I thought I'd do a little show just looking about the whole kind of lockdown situation and some of the ways that we can maybe approach this and maybe we should be approaching this. And my basic viewpoint is really about we should actually be just trying to remember a couple of basic things and trying to see each other's viewpoints. You know, everyone's entitled to a viewpoint. Um, we get encouraged on social media all too quickly to be polarized and get angry when someone's saying something which contradicts our own belief systems. And normally, you know, if you step away and give yourself calm time to digest about things, you normally find that there's a little bit of truth in the middle for both directions. And that's kind of like what I want to try and get through this video today. So some of the points are sort of looking through. I started making points, and I just had so much going on in my head. But some of the points was, you know, when the first thing was that when people turned around and they jumped on the whole COVID-19 thing, and they turned around and said, you know, some elements turned around and said, oh, it's a conspiracy, it was all planned, it's a pandemic, blah blah blah. And other, of course, people turned around and got very hot and kind of very very upset about this. But my attitude is, you know, there is such a thing called seizing opportunity out of crisis, and you know, you look around the world, there are lots of people made, you know, massive amounts of money by seeing when the glass is half full and jumping on that situation. And we've seen during the lockdown, we've seen various flights that come to New Zealand, which have been mentioned in various newspapers about, like as I've done in past shows, tied into companies that are, you know, really looking at extrapolating the potential for profit for themselves out of market failure elsewhere around. So, you know, when people turn around and look at some of these things that are actually happening that have been pushed through by roading and trucking companies and those involved in privatisation, it doesn't necessarily have to be a pre-planned conspiracy. And more importantly, it doesn't matter whether that. What I guess I'm trying to say is that, you know, somebody might believe it's a planned conspiracy and have their ideas, but the halfway point is saying, well, okay, maybe it wasn't planned, but yeah, sure, there are people out there who are going to, you know, opportunists, and they're going to jump on that bandwagon and they're going to do it. And, you know, and tied in with that situation, we start to look at some of the stock, you know, performance of people like Amazon. You know, their shares have actually gone up 1100% since COVID-19. So, and of course, the other one I mentioned was, of course, things like Cargo Metrics, which is tied with Borgerson, who's the guy better known, more famously known, although what he actually does is more important, as the partner for Maxwell Gisling, in other words, the former partner of Jeffrey Epstein. But he's involved in a company called Cargo Metrics, which again are very much looking at ways that they can turn around and look at opportunities which have come out of COVID-19 to create advantages for freight and forward you know, cargo moving companies. So, you know, that point of the idea of people saying, well, actually, you know, here's a way we can actually really make, you know, turn lead into gold is not an unvalid point. We've also turned around seeing that, you know, the politics of the situation. And again, I'm going to try and stay really away from the whole partisan issue, and I'll just stop that for a second because, again, my background's in political science, and I know reasonably well about how various governments and systems work, probably better than the average layperson. I don't claim to know every single government administration, But we fall into this American style politics, which has become very common around the world, thanks again to social media, about the cult of personality. So it doesn't really matter when you look at somebody like Jacinda Ardern or you look at somebody like Donald Trump. Most of the things which they get blamed for and most of the things which they take credit for are largely well put in play well before they even turn up. So the actual leader of states actually really have very little actual say in or power, as just described, despite what we get pushed and propagandized on Hollywood movies all the time. I think it was actually David Longing once made the quip. He said he couldn't even fire two waiters, let alone have the power to actually run a country. And that was of course normal David Longing wit. But the point he was making was that actually we're not all seeing gods, and this whole idea of actually always attributing the faults or the successes of one person is a little bit naive about the way that politics actually runs. Um, of course, within saying that, look, in New Zealand, we had lots of things that were called regardless of who the parliament government is. And again, I always tend to point out, I'm an anarchist in nature. I'm a cynical, and I go, Labour TPA, National TPA, Labour Five Eyes, National Five Eyes. I don't really see a lot of difference between these guys. The party, the rappers on the lolly rappers change all the time, but the wheels and the motion go round, and the bus go round and round. And that's pretty much what we're seeing with things like money that was lent out $200 billion to companies, and it was we had this label put on it said, oh, it was COVID response money that became economic stimulus. And before that, if you look back at the newspapers and you just take the time to not lock down on what social media says, but just go and do a bit of background research. You're not always relying on what Uncle Google and Auntie at YouTube says, but this thing called books and newspapers. You'll find that before that they had a name called economic efficiency. And you'll notice again that over the last few years, administrations, whether it's Labour or National, we've seen the rise of the Ministry of Primary Industries, which has become a ministry, which has become a super ministry and grown more and more in power and actually has more influence in other areas. So, who the figureheads don't really change it much, and it doesn't stop the fact that when things like this actually around the world actually take place, that there are people out there that are very skilled at seizing opportunity out of crisis. And in a nutshell, the real proof of that statement is that pre-COVID-19 we talked about in our common lexicon, most people would refer to the 1%ers, and now post-COVID-19, a new word is corrected into our lexicon, which is the 0.01%ers. I'm kind of get into that very briefly as well. I'm going to kind of start to talk a little bit about the whole science issue, the pluses and minuses of science in the next episode. I think I'll actually introduce that. So if you're listening on the radio show right now live, the song that we would actually be going to right now is I'm going to choice from Oingo Boingo's a classic Weird Science. You're listening to Fresh FM. This is the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen, which I don't think I actually said at the beginning. How rude of me. So here's a little bit of weird science. Down in the laboratory, I'll remove the cause, but not the symptoms of And I'm back on Fresh FM, the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen. I'm sitting here in my comfortable COVID-19 lockdown superhero bathrobe outfit. It doubles as a warm, comfy blanket, but it also is very good if you should happen to get picked up by aliens. And it also makes me look very Jack Nicholson. I do say so myself. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just going to bash your brains in. On that note, let's turn to the wonderful thing I'm talking about today. Science is trying to find the balance between arguments. Instead of people being polarized, is listening to each other, people's, and doing a bit of deep thinking, considering things, and trying to kind of realize that, we all have a piece of the puzzle. We may not have all of it. Maybe some information is wrong, but if we just create dialogue instead of the whole Facebook, yeah, you're right, you're wrong, yeah, I hate you, block, block. We might actually get a little bit further down the food chain, or evolutionary wise, than us bunch of talking monkeys with guns and lawyers are currently doing. So let's get to the wonderful subject of science and vaccination. Again, this is my common observation around the world is that there are many topics in the world where, first of all, when a crisis occurs, we instantaneously become all experts. I mean, when you looked after the Christchurch shootings in March last year, suddenly everybody became an expert on ballistics. Like it didn't matter about myself. I've got 6 years territorial experience. in the artillery. I actually had a job in artillery intelligence. I've had 20, 30 years in Iraqi national security of writing about these subjects. I did my dissertation on terrorism, and yet suddenly what I had to say on the subject didn't make any difference to the person who, whatever their particular dogma of the day was, then they suddenly became an expert on guns. And vaccinations are just the same. And it's interesting when I look about the point I'm making about vaccinations today is that most people make the assumption, or we get encouraged into this polarization thought process. Which is that vaccinations are good. Vaccinations good doggy. Or vaccinations are bad doggy. When reality is, I don't think it's necessarily that black or white. Throughout life or throughout history or since the creation of vaccines, they have undoubtedly saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. I'm sorry if you have a problem with that particular radical thought, but it happens to be the truth. Vaccination actually has done wonderful things, like polio, for example. People no longer needed the iron lung, didn't have many fatalities. But on the flip side, what we also discovered and I'll pick on polio specifically, was that when vaccines were actually made poorly from substituted materials, or when corporations managed to convince the qualities and safety controls to be cut, which of course under COVID-19 there is a large amount of pressure for that to happen. People are afraid, they're willing to kind of sort of take the risk. Politicians are bending towards that situation, and yet when we look at the resurgence of polio around the world, and the common denominator of that has actually been the issue of cross-contaminations of vaccinations. So this has been a situation of vaccines made badly, they weren't quality controlled along the way, but they also then turned around and were put in contact with, but because they were made badly, or more importantly, applied badly, in contact with other various mutants, which have then turned around and created various strains, and now we see the resurgence of polio in lots of places around the world. Again, don't believe me, just go and look at some scholarly articles. Don't even worry about the news feed, don't worry about Auntie YouTube and Uncle Google. Go and look at the scholarly reports, and you'll find that what I'm saying about the issue of cross-contaminations and vaccines is a very, very valid point. Of course, we also turn around and we get into this whole largesse of the wonderful Bill Gates, the man that one of my favourite authors, Douglas Adams, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy guru, lampooned for his ability to create a product such as Windows 10, which simply created a monopoly, and basically each subsequent model became a crappy model, and such as these paradises in his book. He talks about the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation, whose largest area of that company turned out to be the complaints department, numbered several buildings, took up several planets, and they had a company logo on the top of the roof until such time that the roof collapsed, at which point it killed numerous employees, and is now only lit up on special occasions, where it now says, "Go stick your head in a pig." And that was Douglas paradising the wonderful business model of Bill Gates way back in the 1990s. We also forget that the history of companies like Bill Gates, that Bill Gates has been involved in, which include such wonderful companies that are really concerned about your health and well-being, such as BP, McDonald's, Nestle's, Coca-Cola, Monsanto, DuPont, just to name a few of Bill Gates' investments, have been companies which have got terrible records on ethics, quality control, safeties, greed, you name it. They're just not good people. So aside from the fact that Bill Gates just like to jump on planes with people like Jeffrey Epstein, which is you could say is a reflection of what kind of person he is, his own companies really that he's chosen to invest with begin with kind of speak of that. But more importantly, when we turn around, we look at the issue about Bill Gates is that this guy is almost, he's gone from the realm of billionaire rich, and at least from COVID-19 has, and trillionaire rich. He's one of these 0.01%ers, and a lot of these companies have, again, if you go and look at scholarly reports and you go back and you look at newspaper articles not written in the last year or two, but you go back and do a deep dive and look for those articles that were written in the 2015. In fact, go back to articles that were written about the 1990s, when we were people out there that would have been anti the TPA, that thing that we've all now forgotten about, would have been dealing with the WTO. That was when Mike Moore was the Prime Minister, and the former Prime Minister was the chairman of the World Trade Organization, and he was giving us the Codex Alimentarius Stability, which we recognised. If you were left wing, if you were educated, recognised that there was moves by corporations to control food, water, supply, and this was very much what the Codex Alimentarius was all about. This is why they had big riots in Seattle, and this is what we marched against TPA. And now we're all kind of turning around and going, no, that's an outright conspiracy theory, when in actual fact I'm an old school anarchist punk rocker lefty from ages, and I haven't actually changed my values. Just simply the corporate media is now telling me that I'm an alt-right person, which is whatever. But yes, we turn around and we find lots of text here pointing about that basically Gates was actually buying up the ability of he was buying the science. He was buying the tenders and the chairs and around the universities, spending massive amounts of money into the World Bank. And so what I'm basically trying to say to you is that, before we just accept what we see in the newspapers or it's put out by the World Health Organizations, we really need to look at where that money came from, trace it back to the issue. And there are lots of papers out there that point out and say, well, actually, he hasn't given us better science. He's simply, he's bought a dogma, and that's become the dominant dogma of the day. And it's not about good science. And we have this sort of argument, or it's a dogma of the day, which sort of seems to start to become more religious in its own nature. And I mean by that is that it has this belief system, and people get very angry when you challenge it, that science is infallible. Well, first of all, science doesn't work like that. Science isn't a thing that's fixed. It's constantly should always be peer reviewed. It's always been its perspective looked from a situation. There is no right and wrong with science. It's just constantly we learn more and more. And of course, when we turn around, we look at science and we look at the long list of things that we were told by corporations. Oh no, the science tells us this is good for you. I mean, you've got 2,4,5-T, you've got tobacco. You've got Roundup, which of course is the thing that's now leading Monsanto to go into bankruptcy, which is now why it's being bought out by the Bayer Corporation. And of course, one of the employees was James Shaw of the Greens Party, former public relations for lots of interesting companies, none of them which have particularly good ethical records. So we now have James Shaw turning around telling us that, oh no, we must not use 1080, and anyone who says, oh, if you use 1080, you're not educated. Reality is, I don't even want to get into debate because I'm not a scientist. I simply look at the corporations involved and the ones that are pushing the money forward, and I go, I have issues, and I think these are genuine discussions about the lobbying, the power of the lobbying dollar, and we should be talking about those. And the fact that corporate newspapers won't kind of concerns me, because again, look who actually owns these people. And this is the thing I've said about the whole TY point. A lot of things that are not being mentioned at TY point concerning the waste is by local fairly mainstream papers there, is because their interest comes from major corporate entities. And outside, of course, tobacco, 12.5T, you had the wonderful things like nuclear power. Nuclear power was going to save the world. It was going to make us a much better place. And of course, since then, we've had Chernobyl and we've had Fukushima, and we've learned that just like vaccines, that actually nuclear science is not necessarily good or bad, but it's a question of when it is actually applied incorrectly or in the pursuit of profits over people's public safety. Terrible mistakes which have massive consequences happen, and that's the nature of if science is not done thoroughly and dedicatedly. Like in New Zealand, we used to have a thing of your under 30 that you probably don't know about. We used to have this thing called the DSIR, Department of Scientific Institute Research. This was a very independent agency. It was a government agency, but very independent, and it had a much more holistic and it wasn't as influenced by the corporate events as we now get other things sort of science, which are being pushed or influenced by the Ministry of Primary. So I went to recently even a talk or a series of a symposium held at the Copthorne Institute in Nelson, and I listened for about half a day, and the theme of it was talking about science by telling better stories. And ultimately, the conclusion is all these different scientific reps came up and spieled on about the wonderfuls of what they're doing, and that they're all backed by corporations. So what they were saying was that you need to be able to tell your story better, and that was the definition of science, was if you tell your story better. And it wasn't about actually the science; it was all about creating anything to fall into line with legislations and regulations. So again, there is an issue of a devolution of science opposed to what we had previously with the DSIR. We now have something that's much more influenced by the corporate bodies, which again is what we're seeing now with things like the post-TPPA and things like the Crown Investment Partnerships. So of course, we're now realizing, guess what? Plastic bags, which we were told once were going to save us from having to cut down our rainforests, now aren't such a great thing. Throw in things like phthalate and who can fit a Y2K, which kind of brings me back to the whole Windows kind of that kind of thing about the modeling of computer companies, and you kind of go, well, wait a minute, maybe when we start to look at the question about how much, what our solutions to something are going to be, whether it's going to be, we're going to approach it from a holistic viewpoint, we're going to borrow a little bit of the herd immunity with a little bit of the quarantine, which can be surrounded or directed towards the young and the old and vulnerable. Maybe we can have a bit of both, and maybe even to go really radical, maybe we can have a solution if we're all allowed some kind of forum in which we can all put our ideas in and actually come up with something that we actually get to decide what's appropriate for New Zealand, instead of being constantly told by bureaucrats and by cult of personality politicians that we must just follow and listen to them. I don't think actually at the end of the day that's sort of what New Zealanders were really made famous for. That's why we, such as the right for women to vote, 40-hour working weeks, 8-hour shift, all these things which Kiwis ourselves came up with, not politicians. Maybe we need to have a little bit more faith in ourselves, and we need to take that into account when someone gets on the internet and comes up with an idea which seems a bit crazy. Just dismiss them out of hand. Consider it. You'll normally find that everybody's got something to contribute. I think what we'll do is we'll take a little bit of a break before we kind of wrap up the show for today. Since we're looking at the whole issue of the COVID-19 and the wonderful year that's been 2020, let's get on with a wonderful zombie apocalypse little number, which I'm going to call, which we all know as Get Down with the Sickness. Oh yeah. You're on Fresh FM, the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen. I'll see you shortly. And I'm back again. So, of course, you people who are watching this on the YouTube thing going, God, why don't you just carry on? But I'm actually recording this for my radio show, which goes out on Sunday, every second Sunday on Fresh FM. There's a live link there where you can come to my website for the podcasts. Alternatively, you can listen in to me on a Wednesday night at a 9 p.m. Same thing, live stream, or if you can't be bothered for those time zones, so you just come to my website for the podcast, which is Ben Vidgen Investigates postmanproductions.com, and there's a dash in there somewhere, but if you Google it, you should be able to find it. So then, of course, the next thing I'm going to wind up with today's show, and we've talked about the whole issue of never trying to be too polarized. Science isn't actually perfect. And of course, then we get into this whole approach about what shapes our ideas. And tonight, when I looked at the responses on social media after the announcement that, oh my God, Auckland's going back to level 3 and the country's going back to level 2, I saw basically 3 kind of subject matters tonight. There was subject matter number 1, which was fuck you, and we all know who they were saying fuck you to. And again, I get back to that point. Well, there's really no point really blaming one individual person, because nobody actually has that much power, and no one should have anyone give that much power. If you want to be critical about the government, forget about the figurehead, and actually start focusing on the cabinet ministers and the government that lies behind it. We turn around, for example, we saw during Labour time, the only time that we've seen any dip in the polls when Labour's been going actually up is when we're, for a wee moment, we stopped focusing actually on the Prime Minister per se, who's delivers things in a very controlled manner. She's a professional, a very good politician, a professional, her background's in marketing and public relations. So the way they deliver things are very controlled, and you were never going to get anywhere if you did that, which is the whole point of whether it's Donald Trump or Jacinda doing that as the fortress cult of personality. What we did see was we saw a major dip in the polls when we turned around. We started looking at, I think it was David Park. I always get my Parkers and my Clarks. Don't even get me started on that one. Confused, but it was the Minister of Health, and he was found out there riding around on his bicycles and going surfing. Once we turned around, we started to look at the fallibility of the cabinet, of the Labour cabinet. We started to realise that there were issues, and then we saw a 9% drop. But that's not really what I want to talk about before we wind the show up. My point is, the first one was the fuck yous. The second one was like, oh my God, we just got to trust in the government. And if anyone turns around and says says another conspiracy theory, I'm going to call the cops. Well, okay, we'll get into what that all means, but basically the idea is that the idea that you should only trust your government, and you should not question it, and that anybody who questions it is a dangerous person, is a dangerous idea. And if we start to go down that road, I mean, this is the kind of thinking that you get in East Germany and Russia and China, and even parts of Cold War United States, when you hear the McCarthy witch hunt. When you turn around and start actually uh, feeling that you've got a call in the state to beat up people because they've got different ideas from you, then there is an explanation, and hopefully we are actually a much more mature and wiser country than uh, people then to go down that direction. The third and final kind of category of the simplification of the subject matter was the people that were saying, "Oh my God, the guy meant to eat my babies, and I knew this was going to happen, and I told everybody in the God, the aliens and." um, all those three things, as we say on Sesame Street today, were brought to you by the letters C, R, A, and P, and the word fear. So the numbers 1, 2, and 3 all have of the subject matter all have in common one thing, and that is the word fear. All these people, whether they believed that COVID-19 was a planned crisis, or as a crisis where opportunities had come along, or that it was just, my God, the Black Plague is going to come and kill us all, were all producing from fear. And whether they were getting angry or whether they were getting frightful, they were all coming from that flight or flight spot, which is fear. And it doesn't actually help any people. And I sent out on my post for that particular night when I was basically writing it, saying, which is basically, stay calm, come on guys, get a grip. It's I did a little write up, and I did it all in the personation of good old Wal and Dog from Foot Flats with Cooch and cousin Kathy, and so saying, well, we're Kiwis, don't it's not really, at the end of the day, it's not a big a deal. There are far World War One, World War Two, Black Plague, influenza. There's plenty of other things out there in the world which have been far, far worse. And we can't get through this without actually losing our shit. What a bunch of soft pussy millennials. I don't even like to say, I'm talking about cats, of course, nothing else. But we're turning into a bunch of softies. And I think we can all do better than that. And if we keep calm and we keep tolerating each other and we keep our humour, then that's very, very important. Um, you know, you've handled Manawatu with rainless Manawatu summer, and you've driven your tractor into the river and it's neck deep. All these crises which most of us Kiwis in some way or another have some. We're not mall rats. We're Kiwis. We're pretty hardy and durable, and we normally find at the end of the day we keep calm, and at the end of the situation we always have a hot cup of tea and one of cousin Kathy's hot pikelets, and we find that things actually weren't as bad as they were. And I think that's pretty much the whole situation. It's like, guys, it'll only become a horror story if you let it become so in your mind. Um, I'm going to leave it at that tonight. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you really like what we do, this has been an opinion-based show tonight. Most of the time I do investigative stuff. It takes a lot of research. It takes a lot of time. So we have a little donation box on my website, which is the Postman Productions, Ben Vidgen. So feel free to donate that, because it's how I run the show, and basically how I try and make my life as a busker from Koha. My thing is information, but it's something. I'm an artist, but my art's information. Then go to my donation box. Give kindly, give deeply, and if you can't do that because like everyone else, you're a broke ass monkey, then like my page, share some information, tell other people about it, because that all actually helps. And on that particular note, I think we will go out tonight with Monty Python's Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Good night, everyone.